We're really excited to have you all here for the panel this morning. This one's called Buried Narratives. And we've got two really great, interesting papers. First is by Kristen Steadman, and it's called We Made Our Stake in African-American Mining Community in Homestake, Montana. Kristen Steadman graduated with a master's in history from Montana State University in 2025. She is a historian focusing on African Americans in the American West in the 20th century. She holds a BA from Metropolitan State University in Denver in political science and history and was born and raised in Colorado. She's currently working with the National Park Service on implementing the 25th Infantry Bicycle Corps ride from Missoula Yellowstone into the park's interpretation and education. Let's give it up for Kristen.
Good morning. This is going to be really awkward if no one raises their hand, but who was here 2 years ago for the conference in Helena? Good, okay, not awkward. So 2 years ago, I presented with a team of archaeologists, historians, professors, and students on a field school that we did up in Homestake, Montana, focusing on a Black-led mining community and a Black-owned boarding house. At that time, I went last in the presentation, and I had more questions than answers about this project, about this research, and really just had some general statements of African American history and how this family could fit into this. 2 years later, after completing my master's degree and writing a thesis on this story has really developed into a story of perseverance, kinship, ingenuity, and I am very proud of the work that I have done, and I'm proud of the field school and what we started and what we accomplished. So this is what this 2 years of research has come into, the story of the Brown and Flagg families who migrated from Virginia and Kansas to Montana in 1884 to 1892 and lived and worked in Butte, Homestake, and Whitehall through into the 20th century, and some of the family members still live there today. So we're going to do a little bit of a roadmap. First, we're going to meet the family. We're going to figure out where did they come from, why did they come to Montana. Then we're going to go into Homestake. How did this community come to be? Why is it even named Homestake, and why did they stay? And then finally, we're going to get into some vignettes. A 60-page paper is really hard to distill into a 30-minute presentation. So I chose some stories that I feel really represent the family and exemplify my thesis. My thesis, I'll give you a little brief explanation of it because it's pretty long, but the history of the Brown and Flagg families expresses distinctive patterns in the African American experience across the 20th century. Its strong communal focus, the care of extended kin, the importance of learning and knowledge even into adulthood, and finally, the resilience and determination to put down roots exemplifies the African American diaspora throughout the United States. It expands the geography of Black history in Montana and the West, and defies the more common history of displacement and outmigration from the state. So this is a little bit hard to see, but this is a family tree. I'll kind of refer back to this because, as you can see, there's a lot of children and descendants. But what you kind of need to keep in mind is Archer Brown and Harriet Dungy, up in the top left corner, had 7 children that went with them to Homestake. Wallace is the first picture you can see in the second row. Richard, and then Betty, Rachel, Charles, and Nanny. And again, you don't need to remember this. I'll refer back to it. And then Charles and Elizabeth Flagg had only Janetta. And Richard Brown and Janetta Flagg married, and they had 10 children. And I'll kind of refer back to them as we talk about them individually. I credit most of my work to Lena Brown, who gave an oral history in 1989 and really started this project, started the field school, and started my research by telling the story of her family. So we're going to start in Virginia, Cumberland County, Virginia, to be specific. About 1828 to 1884 is when the family lived in Virginia. Harriet was born in 1828, and her children were born roughly from late 1840s to mid-1860s. Cumberland County, if you see right here, the Appomattox River lies on the southwest side, and then Appomattox lies just below that, and then Richmond is above that, about 30 minutes by car today. So if you're thinking about this area during the period of 1828 to 1884, something you may think about is slavery and the Civil War. And the family lived in a hotbed of enslavement, and then during the war, lived right next to where General Lee surrendered at Appomattox. Post-Civil War, we're actually going to look at this little bit of a census. I'll read it out for you because it's hard to read. This is from 1870. We see here Archer Brown at the top is listed as a farmer, and his income or his value for his property was $200, which means that a black man in post-Civil War owned a farm and kept the farm for his family. This is huge. During this time, a lot of African Americans who were either recently freed or were freedmen before the end of the Civil War were losing their property at enormous rates around this area of Virginia. We see Harriet, who was keeping house, so the family had a strong enough income that she did not need to work. Their oldest daughter, Julia, was at work at 12 years old around this time. That actually is kind of a later age for a black girl to be working, but she was at work. However, her brothers, Archer, Wallace, and Richard, were not at work. I found in later census records that all of the siblings were able to read and write, but Archer and Harriet were not able to read and write, which tells me that they got an education at some point. And this is a huge thing for the children that were born in that mid to post-Civil War era. Education was the silver bullet for African American families. This was how their children were going to succeed, and really exemplifies the importance of education and the importance of knowledge. And we'll actually see later on why this is important for how they came to put down roots at Homestake. Next, we're going to go to Kansas, Leavenworth to be specific. This is where Charles and Elizabeth Flagg are first found in the records. Their birth dates and census say Virginia. I have no idea how they got from Virginia to Kansas, but here we are. What I have first from Charles is his fighting in the 2nd Colored Infantry in Leavenworth during the Civil War. He personally knew Colonel D.R. Anthony, who was the brother of Susan B. Anthony. He actually wrote to him when he moved to Butte, and Colonel Anthony owned the Leavenworth Times at this point and published Charles's letter in the paper. So after the Civil War, the family stayed. Charles and Janetta had Elizabeth, and about 10 years after the Civil War, Charles was appointed as a police officer and worked for 10 years in Leavenworth. If you see here, it describes Flagg as the solid man, and this was a frequent description of Charles, either the solid man or the strong man on the force. So he was a police officer for 10 years in Leavenworth, and then the family, for whatever reason, decided to move to Montana. They moved first to Bozeman, lived there for a year, and then moved up to Butte. And here, this is a paper from Leavenworth. It says, Charlie Flagg, well known here, writes the times that he is removed from Bozeman to Butte, Montana. He thinks the latter place is the paradise for working men, and says the monthly payrolls foot up to $594,000. So this paradise for working man seems a little weird when you think about Homestake as we know it today. It wasn't, the I-90 pass that some of us may think of. And it also was not the peaceful and serene dispersed camping that some of us may think of. This was a place of industry and labor. When the Homestake and the Flagg and Brown families were kind of at their zenith, there were 10 stamp mills reverberating through gulches. Iron on iron slamming could be heard all throughout the area. Train whistles coming through, and just a lot of tailing ponds, sludge through rivers. This was not a serene place. This was kind of a gritty, ugly place. But to Charles, it was paradise because he was able to work and put down roots for his family. So next, we're going to move into Homestake. How these two families are connected is in 1892, Richard and Janetta married and connected the two families together. I have not found kind of how these two families came to be on Homestake together. There is some evidence from Lena's oral history that Richard Brown at least found employment through the Gold Flint Mining Company, which is what Homestake was originally going to be called, was Gold Flint. So it's possible that Charles also found employment there, really not sure. Anyway, all to say, Charles got there first with his family in 1884. If you know anything about Butte Anaconda mining history, that's the same year that the Anaconda smelter was built. So Charles arrived at the beginning of the copper boom in Butte. How did they put down these roots? I have a few theories. The separation from Butte to Homestake was a huge factor. At this point, the railroad was not built. It was built in 1891, connecting Butte to Homestake. So Homestake was pretty isolated from Butte. As some of you may know, driving even 4 service roads today up there can be a little bit of a dicey game. So imagine a wagon trail carrying thousands of pounds of machinery up the mountain after a really hard winter. So if machinery went up the mountain, it stayed up the mountain. And this was a big deal for the family because a lot of smaller companies like the Gold Flint, some smaller investors, as we'll see actually the namesake of Camp Caroline Van Horn, some of these companies didn't want to deal with Butte and deal with the enormity of the Copper Kings and the labor and everything that was coming out of Butte. So they decided to try their hand next to Butte. And unfortunately, most of them had a boom and a bust, as we see so frequently with mining. The good thing for the Browns and Flaggs is they had put down these roots enough and they had learned mining techniques from these smaller companies as they were working for them while also working their own individual claims, that then when those companies had a bust and they couldn't bring machinery back down the mountain, the Browns and Flaggs could then make a deal with them to keep the machinery on the mountain, give them a little bit of money, and then use it for their own businesses and their own mines and their own claims. So this really helped them kind of settle in. A second thing is there were multiple claimants. My theory is that in Virginia, after Archer's death, Archer, the husband, had died in 1884. Forgot to mention that. Died in 1884 from typhoid, and the family lost the farm, and that's why they ended up moving into Montana. And my theory is that Archer was the sole person on the deed to the property, and that is why they lost the farm. So introducing multiple claimants into the plasters and loads that they had made it happen that if a mining accident were to occur and the men were wiped out or individual men were wiped out, the women could still have a stake in the mining enterprises. We'll actually see here on the left side, it mentions the Lucy Leon Placer claim and mentions Charles, Elizabeth, Richard, Wallace, Harriet, and Betty as claimants on this mine. Next to it in the middle, it says gold mine found by Color Girl. Miss Nanny Brown, Harriet and Archer's daughter, discovered a gold vein while walking to go get the family cow one day, twisted her ankle in a hole, and found a lump of gold. It's a very interesting story. She's actually noted here as the Queen of Homestake. And she and her brothers and her soon-to-be husband went and had the gold tested, kept it quiet until the results came out, and then she was listed as a claimant on that vein of gold, giving her some extra income. So I think the multiple claimants really helped make sure that the family had these roots put down. Lastly would be education. This education allowed them to sue for unpaid goods and services multiple times in the court systems, from smaller companies, from individual miners. Go take me for a cup of coffee sometime and I'll tell you about it because it's pretty interesting. Don't have time to get into it now. But by 1891, the family was settled. And then the railroad came in. So then they were able to utilize that connection from Homestake to Butte and get their ore smelted, get their ore tested, have it sold into bigger areas. So they were very well settled by the time that connection came through. The family were actually the ones to get it named Homestake. Story goes from the family that they were up at the train depot as it was getting finished, getting built, and some surveyors were up there and they were asking, well, what are we going to name this? Should we name it Goldflint? Should we name it Jefferson 2? What should we name this? And reportedly, Wallace said, we made our stake here and called it home. We'll call it Homestake. So once the railroad was put through and the family settled, they could keep and benefit from that connection to Butte. They actually kept 2 houses on the east side of Butte for winter or other needs requiring them to be in town. And they also kept a house in Whitehall for when Richard and Janetta's boys, specifically, Lena didn't go to school till she was in 5th grade because the boys would ski and walk to school 4 miles each way every day. So when the Homestake school closed, the boys would go to Whitehall, and that was why they kept the house there. The center of Homestake was the family's boarding house, seen up here. It's kind of a grainy picture, but you can see there's like a little porch area. This doesn't have the addition of the kitchen on it. That was added a little bit later, but this was the boarding house up in Lions Gulch. The boarding house was the center of this community in multiple ways. One of my favorite stories from Lena's oral history is that every 4th of July, her family would make strawberry shortcake together. They would go and pick strawberries from a field that I have yet to find and would love to find, and would go pick strawberries, make strawberry shortcake, and inevitably, it would hail on the 4th of July. So they would go take the ice from the hail and make ice cream. This story really reverberated with me because at the field school, we actually found a piece of linoleum where we believe the kitchen to be. So for me, this connected that, first of all, the family had money that they could spruce up an interior room in a place that the public normally did not go. This was a place that Janetta, Elizabeth, Harriet, Nanny, Betty, and Lena frequently went into to cook 3 meals a day for the miners. I believe it was $5 a week for 21 meals for the miners. So they were really living in that kitchen. So this was an interior to spruce up for the women, because as women and people who live in the kitchen know, having these simple upgrades makes the experience more pleasing. So this would have been possibly the linoleum, good grief, that Lena stood on while she was making strawberry shortcake with her family and bringing in buckets of ice to make ice cream with. So that really just stuck with me at the field school and then in my further research. The boarding house also was an important place for political reasons. From the 1880s into the 1960s, a brown male was always an election judge at Homestake. If you know anything about African American history, the 1890s to the 1960s are some of the most volatile periods of African American history. Lynchings, political disenfranchisement, civil rights, segregation were huge at this time. And up in the mountains, we see Black men trusted not only by their community, but by election officials first in Boulder and then in Jefferson County as a whole, to not only oversee elections, but then to telegraph those results further out. So they were trusted by the community, and then they were also trusted by their county. Oh, this was actually found by the Butte Archives or the Silverbow Butte Archives. We have no idea where this came from, no idea where this was, but I love the Camp Caroline little sign on there. Caroline Van Horn was the woman that originally owned this structure. She was a wealthy woman from Chicago who tried her hand at mining and ultimately had a bust. And the family acquired this property and turned it into the boarding house. So the family lived primarily in Homestake from 1891 to 1936. As the original generation passed on, the children of Richard and Janetta carried on their family legacy, spreading their community into Whitehall and Butte while keeping property at Homestake. You can see here on the top left side, Butte pioneers called by death. Mrs. Janetta Brown came west in 1880. So these were considered pioneers to Butte, Homestake, Whitehall. Most people who knew them considered them pioneers of this area. I'm going to kind of jump into a little bit of the family, the siblings, because there's a lot of them, and I'm running out of time. So I'm just going to kind of look at some of their individual accomplishments, because they really contributed to their community just as their parents and uncles and aunts had. Okay. One more thing before I do that. when I think of the family, I think of Wallace Stegner's notion of stickers, that this family had tragedy. They had economic hardship. They had some failures as a family and very well could have moved on with many other African Americans who moved further west in the interwar to World War II period. The family actually lost two of the brothers, Edwin and Theodore, within 3 weeks of each other in 1925. And there was some stuff around that very well could have made the family push out and go further west. But they decided to stick, and they decided to keep their roots and put themselves in Montana and stay there. So we're going to start with Lena, because even though she's the youngest, I like her. I'm the youngest, so figured we should start with her. So Lena was the Pearl Club president. The Pearl Club was a section of the Montana Federation of Negro Women's Clubs. And as she got older, she took over the job. Her mother was co-president, Harriet, and then she took over the job from her grandmother and became president. She was also the founder of the Montana Institute of the Arts, or a founder, I should say, and was frequently a chair or overseer of the history and photography clubs. Again, I credit all of my work to her oral history in 1989. The Montana Historical Society actually has it, if you would like to see it. Next, we'll go into Herbert and Hiawatha. If you know anything about sports in Butte, Herb and Hiawatha were legendary track stars in Butte. I have a really cool story about them actually almost getting kicked out of track in the 1930s. Come see me afterwards and I'll tell you about it. But after their teenage years and their athletic prowess, Hiawatha would go on to coach baseball and track. And Herbert started the Butte Ski Club for working class men in the 50s and 60s. Basically, his goal with that was the boys learned how to ski as a way of transportation. And he felt that as the skiing industry was kind of ramping up and it was becoming more of an upper class thing, that he wanted to make sure that middle and working class men who had skied as boys for transportation could bring that into adulthood and have a bit of recreation and fun. Herb married Genevieve Driver, who was the sister of Perdita Duncan. Walter and Perdita Duncan were prominent African Americans in Butte, further connecting them to the community. Hiawatha died young and unexpectedly, as did most of the men in the family due to a mysterious illness. Most of them actually dropped dead of heart attacks in their 40s and 50s. But after Hiawatha's death, a baseball field was named in his honor in Butte, and I believe is still named in his honor today. Next, we'll look at Joseph, where is Joseph? Okay, sorry, forgot to refer back to this. Lena here, Herbert and Hiawatha. Joseph is the little one smiling right here, very sweet. Joseph fought with the Black Panthers in World War II. Also known as the 761st Tank Battalion in Europe, and fought under General Patton. Here you can see actually on the bottom, it mentions Joseph. Here, I don't need to point. I have a pointer. Staff Sergeant Joseph D. Brown and Private Oscar Brown left. They were actually in the States when their mother died, so they were granted emergency leave and were able to come home and be with the family for their mother Janetta's death. Here we actually see a letter. This was published in the 40s as kind of a callback to World War I and some of the letters during World War II. They wanted to kind of show it on this day kind of thing. And this is a letter that Edwin wrote to his father, talking about how the fighting is hard, but we are going through the Huns like wind through the trees. Edwin would eventually pass away from a lung disease acquired by chemical warfare in World War I. So we got Edwin, Joseph, Delmas. Delmas was an advocate for anti-poverty and disability rights for Butte workers, and he helped guide EMS and recovery efforts when the airplane crashed in Homestake in the 50s. And he was specifically mentioned by the recovery chief for his ability to navigate the landscape and find wreckage and recovered bodies. This is taken from a much larger newspaper article on Homestake. It was written in 1965. and details more of the family, but it's kind of hard to read, so I just took the cool pictures. There we go. Here you have Richard, Joseph, Delmas. This is Delmas's wife, Inez, and then Lena here. And then this is kind of hard to see. Lena talks about in her oral history that sometimes she would confuse her father and uncles because they all looked the same with their really big mustaches, if you can see here. So this one on the far left is Richard. And as a guess, just based on Lena's descriptions, I'm guessing this one is Charles. And this is Wallace. But these are kind of the men of Homestake that started the area. So, in conclusion, Butte and Homestake and Whitehall were hardly untouched by the impact of the Brown and Flagg families. Their contributions to the community still reverberate into the 21st century. In my research, I actually came across a newspaper from 1999 to 2000 of a woman who wrote about her dear friend from childhood, Wallace Brown, the caretaker of Camp Caroline near Homestake, Montana. And she dedicated her lighting of Our Lady of the Rockies on New Year's Eve to Wallace. So over 100 years after Wallace set foot in Montana, he was still remembered as a caretaker and a dear friend. This legacy and dedication to their community spurred me through my 2 years of work, and I'm very grateful to share it all with you today. Thank you.